Welcome back to the Band Guide, where we use GarageBand to create professional sounding music. I'm your band guy, Colin, and today I want to talk to you about kind of a secret with EQ. This is something that people just don't talk about enough with EQ. But before we get into that, I just have to say, EQ is our most powerful mixing tool. If you're not using EQ and you're not really familiar with how to use EQ, then you're missing out on the most powerful tool you have to shape your mix to sound clear and clean and full and professional. Every mix you've ever heard has some amount of EQ on it, right? This is such a big part of the mixing process. So you need to learn EQ. But before we even get into today's video, I want to give you something to help with that. I've put together a completely free EQ cheat sheet that walks through more or less everything you need to know about EQ in a short PDF guide. So download it from the link in the description below. It's really going to help you out. It's already helped out thousands of people. So I know this will help you out. So be sure to grab it from the link in the description below. But let's go and talk about this secret. Now, if you don't understand EQ, a brief overview of EQ is that it basically is just raising or lowering the volume of different frequencies in our mix. Now, that sounds complicated, but really we're just thinking like bass, mids, and trebles. So the low end down here, the mid range up here, and the super bright frequencies up here. And you're just lowering or reducing the frequencies, or in this case, cutting them completely out. So here I've cut out any sort of sub frequencies on this particular source. Now, you can use an EQ on anything. You can put it on individual tracks here. So here we were looking at it on a snare track. I've multi-tracked out my drums. If you haven't seen my video on that, I'll link to that above here. I've multi-tracked out my drums so I have ultimate control and can EQ the snare alone separately. And I'm applying this EQ to just that one track. Now to get here, I hit B on my keyboard to bring up my smart control window, and then it's just the channel EQ under the plugin list here. Now this is just the stock GarageBand EQ, and it's great. I honestly prefer it to the Pro Tools EQ. The Pro Tools EQ, which is a $600 piece of mixing software, is embarrassing compared to this EQ. This one is so much better. But you could also have it on your master track. Now your master track, you just click over to master here, and now we're looking at that. And this EQ is impacting our entire mix in one place. So if I play this here and I boost around, you'll hear this is affecting the entire mix, right? So you have low end down here, mid range, up to bright frequencies. Okay, so that's EQ in a really quick synopsis. The last thing you need to know for this video going into it is that in this bottom left corner here, we have an analyzer. That is going to turn on what's allowing us to see what's going on here with our mix. And that's really important for this trick today. So let's go ahead and jump back over to our snare track, because this trick is really best used on individual tracks, not on your entire mix, not on your master track, but on an individual track. So here we're talking about it on the snare specifically. And what I want to show you here is when we have this analyzer on, we see this information here. But what exactly are we really looking at? Well, what's really important to understand, and the secret, if you will, that is really just a secret because people think it's kind of boring, but it's actually just a very fundamental thing to know is, and funny that I said fundamental, is the fundamental of a sound. Now, the fundamental just means the lowest actual tonal pitch in that sound. So even something like a snare drum has a lowest tone to the pitch. So you'll see here, this lowest part is the fundamental of the snare drum. If I boost this way up, you'll hear that if I exaggerate, it doesn't actually sound particularly good, but that is the fundamental. That is the lowest harmonic tone of the mix, or melodic tone of the mix. And then everything above that is some sort of relative harmonic to that. So this is the actual pitch of the snare, and then everything above that is just a harmonic relative to that. And so this trick that I want to talk to you about today is using that fundamental to add fullness. So if you have a source and it just feels a little bit thin to you, finding the fundamental and giving it a slight boost around the fundamental in the context of your mix can help it have a little bit more fullness, right? So here on this snare, if you listen to it in solo, if I bring this back up to about where it was, if I turn this off, it's subtle, but that snare feels kind of thin in comparison to when I add it back in. Right? It's a little bit fuller, just has a little bit more body. And you can even hear that in the context of the mix here. This is on. When I turn it off, the snare feels a little bit thin. It's not drastic. Mixing should be subtle. But it really helps. It gives it a little bit more body. Now, you can't go do this on every single source in your entire mix in most mixes, because eventually that is likely going to cloud things up. If you always add more and more body to everything, then a lot of things are going to end up feeling a little bit muddy because you've put too much of this like low mid information in. But doing it on the right sources that really stand out to you in the mix, finding what really needs a little bit more body and giving it a little bit more body can be really helpful. So for example, this song has a really big floor tom part here. Just big to the song, it's important. And so here, I'm also boosting a little bit of the fundamental. So if I take this boost away, that floor tom feels a little bit thin, right? Add it back in, it's a little bit fuller. Right, turn the whole thing off, feels a little bit papery. So finding that fundamental, giving a little bit of a boost, lets that floor tom feel fuller in the context of the mix. And the last example I'll give you of this is actually on the vocals. So this is something I missed for a long time. We'll go down here to this lead vocal part. Now in this lead vocal, the original way that I mix this song, I actually cut everything out up until 150, almost 200 hertz here. If you see 100, 200, somewhere around here is the way I used to cut all my EQs. So I'd actually be cutting all the way up to here. But you'll see the fundamental of this vocal is kind of dancing around somewhere around here. And if he goes to lower notes, or when he goes to lower notes, it actually will go down closer to 100. So what I've done here is I've actually boosted around the fundamental, and that brings out a lot of body in this vocal. If we listen to this in solo, if I turn this EQ off,
instead of crying at the table,
it's a little bit muddy and it doesn't sound full. If I add this on,
instead of crying at the table,
right, it's full, yet it has
names.
Clarity, right? So it's full and clear, and that's a sweet spot if you ask me. And so the brightness is coming from up here, but the body is coming from down here. If I just turn this off,
instead of crying at the table,
it feels a little bit thin. If I add this back in,
instead of crying at the table,
it feels a little bit fuller, right? And so I'm finding this fundamental, I'm boosting that a little bit, and that's adding a little bit more body to the voice. So again, you don't need to do this on everything. Maybe your vocal actually has too much of the fundamental. Maybe you actually need to come in, and you can see that here. Maybe your vocal fundamental is way up here while everything else is way down here. So maybe you actually need to come in and reduce it a little bit. Or maybe your first harmonic, the stuff just above the fundamental, is really overpowering your vocal. A lot of times in my recent recordings, I've been noticing that. And so I'll come in and I'll boost or cut a little bit right here. I won't even need to boost the fundamental, this lowest part, but just by cutting right above it, I get a little bit more, or I hear a little bit more of that. So knowing this difference, understanding where the fundamental is kind of the secret to unlocking fullness in your mixes, finding it on the key sources and giving a little bit more of it when needed, or getting rid of something that maybe is clouding it, can be huge for getting fullness in your mixes. Okay, if you don't already have it, be sure to grab my free EQ cheat sheet from the link in the description below. And before you go, I want to hear from you. Have you heard about fundamentals versus harmonics before? Let me know in the comments. This is a huge part of mixing that all the pro mix engineers know and they use at the appropriate times. And by learning this and starting to apply it at the appropriate times, you can mix like a pro as well. So be sure to grab that EQ cheat sheet. Let me know in the comments below if you've heard of fundamentals versus harmonics. And if this video is helpful, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you next week with another video.